Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I am very pleased to be talking with David Barabee, a science journalist, an independent thinker, one of the very few people who is able to live by his wits outside of an university setting. Welcome, David.
Thank you, David. It's nice to talk with you again.
David, we go back all the way to, I think, 1994, if I'm right, when you wrote a New York Times article about me.
That's right.
And we've been keeping up ever since. You are the author of a book, Us and Them, which is The Science of Identity, which is your contribution to the scientific literature on a topic which is absolutely central and which we will be talking about today. I have lots of things I want to talk to you about, but I want to center it on the whole concept of science and science journalism. As a way of getting there, tell us a little bit about your current focus on what you call a post-rational age.
Sure. Well, I've been writing this blog for Big Think on this theme for a while, and now it's I think going to become a book. The theme being essentially that we have a lot of information now, a lot of insight into human nature, thanks in large part to an evolutionary perspective being brought to bear on people. And it's telling us that we don't really know our own minds. We often don't know the sources of our decisions or our perceptions, and that the things that cause us to do or avoid doing things are quite a bit different from the stories that we tell ourselves. And this is, of course, the subject of a great many recent books. However, what I think hasn't really been appreciated yet is that while we are talking to ourselves about nudge and blink and sway and so on, to name a few monosyllabic titles of books, we're still living by the rules that the 18th century model of the mind bequeathed us, the sort of rationalist notion that when it comes down to it, when it's really important, you kind of put aside your messy emotions and your confusion, and you make a decision as a rational economic individual. I think the difference between what we know about how people really operate and the kind of official basis for institutions like courts and elections and markets and medical care it's going to be a bigger and bigger problem, and that's an interesting subject to me. Not just the news is not, oh, hey, you know what? People are not as rational as they like to think, or not as conscious as they like to think. It's not. That's not the news. The news is, what do we do about it? Right. What do we do when you go to the voting booth and, in theory, you're supposed to be lining up your interests with the platforms of the people you have been told about and deciding coolly and calculatedly who to vote for, but in reality, often the taller person wins. Or in reality, there's an effect of where you're voting. So if you're voting in a school, you're more likely to vote for an education tax increase than if you're voting in a firehouse. What do we do about that? I mean, we don't want to just throw out the Enlightenment, but we kind of can't live with this kind of fictional notion of what we're about that much longer. Anyway, so that's the theme of the blog and the upcoming book.
Well, you know, there's two paradoxical themes. One is the one that you just articulated, which more or less portrays us as much less rational, much more fallible, controlled by things that we don't know about, all of which would seem to make people and societies work more poorly.
Yeah.
But then we have the theme that actually we're an ultra-cooperative species, that our societies can work very well, although in a way that we don't understand, because we're a part of a superorganism, to put it in strong terms. And it's interesting to think about how those themes go together. It's not obvious how they would go together, but
Right.
I think that part of what's very new and what some people call a second enlightenment, basically, saying that we really should be basing our science, our current social processes on what we know now, not the first enlightenment, but what we know now, and the difference is enough that we should actually be calling it a second enlightenment.
Right.
Then that's interesting that there should be those two themes. Well, so now I want to. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want to say something?
Well, yeah. No, I think that's very interesting, because if you want to talk about a second enlightenment, think what's so far missing from this second one is the Adam Smiths and the Immanuel Kants who can sort of assemble all of these disparate sort of insights into kind of a coherent explanation for how to organize society. Because without that, it's true. I mean, we had a very effective critique of what is sort of slowly eroding, or maybe not so slowly eroding, as a notion of what we're doing in society, but not yet that vision for how to reconcile the notion, the information about human nature with the okay, well, what do we do? How do we run an election that's fair? How do we have a society that's fair? How do we avoid a nudgeocracy or a society where there's a lot of spin and manipulation? And these are all big issues that have to do with sort of getting the Second Enlightenment insights into sort of operational packaging.
Right, and that term Second Enlightenment was coined by Eric Liu and Nick Hanauer, who I've interviewed separately, and I'll tell you, David, about them more, but also we'll provide some links to those particular interviews and their efforts to form a new narrative that's based on this. Well, let's get to the topics of science journalism, and how they differ from other forms of discourse, which can go so bad. I think that I often like to wax poetic about science. I like to say that it's a form of disagreement, but it's a more productive form of disagreement than other kinds of discourse. And so let's talk a little bit about science, and how do you say that sort of thing, if you say it at all?
Well, I mean, I think that people who write about science for non-scientists, we're in a very kind of funny position. I mean, we're being kind of pulled in two different directions in the following sense. I mean, I think science is a way of constructing explanations for causes that we see around us, and in that sense, particularity, the particular individual case is not in the foreground. In other words, if I mean, sometimes we'll put it. I mean, if I can know from if I have 3 or 4 facts and a theory about you, and with that I can predict what toothpaste you're going to buy, what movie you're going to see on Friday, which show you're going to want to go, what car you drive, all that sort of thing. If I can do that, I don't need to know your name, right? I don't need to know. I mean, and in a sense, I'm treating you as exactly equivalent to the other person who I can make an equal prediction for. So that's, to me, that science is looking for these patterns or principles that allow you to do that. I don't have sacred texts. I'm saying David, it's the search for that.
David, you broke up.
Go ahead, but
you broke up there. Just repeat the last 15 seconds of what you just said.
Okay, I mean, I would say that to me, it's that science is the search for those sort of principles that are, by definition, not dependent on particular individuals or particular circumstances, that are generalizable in some way, right? Okay. So, but what is a narrative? What is the thing that people, when they talk about themselves or they talk about anyone else who's a person, what is a story? A story is exactly the opposite. A story is all about individuation. It's about a particular person's particular history, particular circumstances. And so we who write about science are, in a sense, attempting to instruct people on how to think outside of stories, but we're supposed to do it by telling them stories. And that's a somewhat paradoxical position to be in. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible. There are a lot of people who do it very well, but it's a nice needle to thread. The universal complaint when you write about science is, well, why did you write about the color of my car or what I said to my mother when instead of the great ideas? And the universal complaint of editors to whom you give the work you've written is, well, why are we talking about these abstract ideas? Why, people are excited about the fact that he drives a Ferrari or something. So we're kind of living with this kind of tension, which I think is very important in the modern world, because I think that stories are congenial to us. Stories are I think there's a good argument to be made, and a former student of yours that makes it in a really nice book I'm reading now called The Storytelling Animal. That a propensity to focus on stories and depend on them and organize the world with stories is really an evolved propensity. But at the same time, you really need to understand things in the modern world that don't fit that structure at all.
Okay, well, I think you made a very interesting distinction that I didn't see coming, and it is an interesting distinction that telling a story is different than an abstract scientific analysis, and we are so much a storytelling species that we need to convert abstractions into stories. I'd like to add one thing, which is that sometimes the story, what science needs to address is a story. For example, evolution is a historical science.
Right.
There's a story for every particular species, how it evolved.
Right.
It can be told in a story-like fashion, but it has to be a true story, not a false one. So there's the matter of determining the facts of the matter for a story, and there's the need for the story to be a factual story as opposed to a fictional story.
Right.
And so what I'd like to get to next is what are the responsible rules for science? I've begun to think of science as like a sport with rules and the need for refereeing. And
sure.
That might be a kind of a newfangled metaphor, but everyone knows that there's something called a scientific method, and that we're supposed to abide by certain rules. And so I'd like to ask, in parallel, what are the rules for responsible science? How's a scientist supposed to behave? What would be a clear infraction for a scientist? And the same for a science journalist, because not everything goes for a science journalist. Not everything goes for a journalist, for that matter.
Well, I mean, I think clear infraction is making stuff up.
You don't want to make stuff up.
Like the Dutch, I can't think of his name, but I can certainly find a link to the stories. There's a rather prominent Dutch psychologist who is important in some social psychological findings. For example, there was a paper he did that said basically people were more inclined to be prejudiced against outgroups in a messy room than in a neat room. The kind of thing that sticks in your mind because it's a good story.
Right. And it's another example of post-rational.
Yeah. But anyway, he made it up. He had, I think, scores of papers that have been retracted because he basically was fabricating the data. So there's a clear case. I sometimes wonder about something that is, again, less a matter of misconduct by a bad apple than something that is just kind of human nature, which is I'm really struck by how often when I write about something, the more I know about it, the more I realize the people who did the experiment I'm writing about, or the working on the theory that I'm writing about, will tell you, well, we have this anomalous result, and we're not sure how to account for this, and of course we need to do more work on this. And yet, when other people pick it up, I don't mean in readers of the New York Times, I mean other scientists, they'll say, well, so-and-so has shown in this work that this is the case. Right. Because nobody has the time to examine everything that comes in especially from other disciplines. And so I think the effect is that a lot of experiments are done once, and then people say, okay, well, that's an established finding. Nobody ever tries to replicate it. Is it really well established? I mean, it's established not because I think the textbook image is that it's established because 300 people did the experiment. They all came up with similar results or an explanation for why they couldn't come up with the result. When in fact, often what happens is one person did the experiment and then somebody like me wrote about it and everybody said, okay, now we know this. So that's, I think, a more subtle form of, I mean, I wouldn't call that misconduct because no one's doing anything wrong, but it's sort of, it's kind of an institutionalized difference from the ideal of science as it's sort of imagined. Which is why every once in a while I like to take a look at this website for something called the Journal in Support of the Null Hypothesis.
Right.
Which is simply papers where people say, okay, this such and such a paper said this, and we tried it and it didn't work. The end.
Right.
Which is great because, people don't do much of that. And so I think that, that might be an issue worth thinking about that is not about, well, there's some bad people or scared people who sort of go down the slippery slope, one time or two, but just kind of, again, our kind of built-in predilection to be efficient and accept narratives that are congenial to us and move on, to make use of stories that are told to us rather than to question them. Maybe that's the biggest difference. Maybe science is supposed to be about, you tell me something and I immediately say, how do you know that? And are you sure? And maybe it was an effect of the electrical supply in your lab or something. Whereas in stories, what I'm supposed to do is go, wow, yeah, tell me more. And maybe that's the big difference between the storytelling mode and the scientific analysis mode.
So to summarize, science is a social process. It's not a matter of people consciously behaving badly. That happens sometimes, but it's also a matter of people being fallible even at the best of times, in part because we have that post-rational mind. So a single person is incapable of arriving at the facts of the matter, at least most of the time. And so what that means is that science is a matter of people holding themselves accountable, basically, and always cross-checking each other and challenging each other in a systematic way that results in something that we can call progress and the accumulation of knowledge.
Right. I like the definition in a biography I read not long ago that science is not a collection of absolute truths. It is a method for reducing ignorance.
Perfect. And it's a process. That means, and I'm thinking about this a lot now because in the capacity of evolution, this view of life, we're now reporting science. And I don't want to report it as fact. I want to report the process of science.
Yeah.
I want to say that scientists do disagree with each other, but they disagree with each other in a certain way.
Yeah.
And it's that which makes us worth listening to, as opposed to some other way. Now, let's focus on some of the other ways that people disagree with each other, which are not so productive. And we're wallowing in those ways. So why is it that public discourse, non-scientific public discourse, seems to have gotten so bad and so unproductive? Or maybe you disagree with that assessment.
No, but I would argue that that's not actually removed from your science theme at all, because a great deal of public discourse now turns on science. And I would, for example, cite global warming, climate change, anything to do with long-term non-communicable diseases, which is a huge growing problem all over the world. You don't get adult onset diabetes or heart condition or high stroke risk from generally not from catching it from somebody else, so like an infectious disease. You get it from the things you do every single day habitually, what you eat and how you behave. At least that's the going theory. There's some people who are skeptical of that, and that's interesting too. But that's maybe a good example of disagreement that needs to be aired. But so if you take climate change and you take keeping people healthier, having a population not succumb to these diseases that are lifestyle related. In both those cases, you have a scientific input. You have people saying, "Look, we've done studies. Here are our results," and then you have this resistance to that, which is everything that you describe as wrong with our discourse. That is to say, it's fundamentally tribal. It's not about the ideas. It's about where you stand. I mean, when Rick Santorum gets up and says that that he thinks climate change is a conspiracy by money-mad scientists to keep the coffers full. And that's not a response to the data, I don't think. That is a way of saying, this is my flag. You know, if you're a certain kind of American citizen, a certain kind of a person with a certain set of values, then you will agree with me on this. So, in other words, it has the surface.
Hello, this is David Stone Wilson with part 2 of my interview with David Barabee. And when we were rudely cut off by Skype, we were talking about the difference between scientific discourse, which we hope results in progress, and other forms of discourse which do not. So what is it that makes discourse so bad?
Right. I think that certainly one reason that is inescapable is the fact that well, it relates to the point you were making about stories earlier, which is that our attachment to stories is in some sense a statement of identity of who we are and what we care about. So that whether or not you believe a story, and I don't just mean a he said, she said, I went to the store, I came back kind of a story, but a story in the sense of an explanation for why the country has a deficit or why the world's weather is changing. It's very easy for belief in a particular story to be a marker of identity, of who you are and of who your friends are, at which point you cannot cease to believe it when there's contrary evidence, because you are no longer giving up simply an opinion based on facts. You're giving up your friends. You're giving up your notion of who you are. So I think it's a huge problem when a scientific subject becomes a tribal badge. And of course, more and more issues in public life and public policy are scientific subjects. And it's very interesting. I mean, science is the gold standard for reason and fact. So that when people want to deny evolution, for example, they don't say, "Well, God doesn't want us to believe this." They say, "Oh, well, you know, the science isn't good. There's fossils that are missing. It's just a theory." They set up institutes of creation science, right? So no one says science is bad. Let's forget about science. People say our science is better than their science. And that's very interesting. That argument about science's authority, about who gets to say what science is, once it stops being about evidence, once it starts being about identity, there's no longer any exchange of ideas. There's just the pretense of exchange of ideas. I mean, people come so close, don't they? They come so close to really getting how the mind works, because you can always spot other people's folly. You can always spot the idiocies in other people's stories, and that's a way in which a lot of the kind of stuff I write about is misused. I think it's used to say we are superior to those people who believe this irrational thing. Whereas I think a better use of these kinds of lines of research is to look at oneself rather than to find yet another reason to bash people you don't like anyway. I think Tyler Cowen, an economist, has said some intelligent things about narratives and their influence on people. He says every time that you hear a story about good versus evil, you should subtract 10 points from your IQ. And I think that's a good rule of thumb. I think if you start to think in those terms about anything, you should be wary, because that is the attraction of that narrative is about a story structure, and it's not about the contents of the story. And I think this is just as true for the advocates of science, the friends of science, as it is for people who want to deny what science is and what science is telling us.
How is it just as true for them?
Well, in the sense that you see a lot of this, I think, in the environmental community, where the notion that um, you see a certain discourse that is in the lines of, what do we do to fix these people who have something wrong with them? The people who don't believe what we believe about climate change. And that is a fair question if the question is something like, why can't we get people to recycle? And could we slightly rejigger the announcements and the signs and the pamphlets that they receive so that they will recycle more because that's better for everyone? That's it seems to me a legitimate use of psychological insight. But I've seen it transform into, how can we who know the truth get these people who are clearly have something wrong with their heads to do what we want? And that's just fatal. That's just fatal because, for one thing, no one has a monopoly on the truth. And the people who say, well, scientific truth says we must do this policy position, they're also denying science, I think, even if they are citing scientific evidence, because what they're denying is the possibility that science can change. And so there's that, I think.
Well, it seems to me that there's some complexities here because science is all about rejecting things and making sure that others reject them too. When you pass a certain threshold, such as the Earth is round, continents drift, if you deny things at that point, then basically science grinds to a halt. And to take more problematic cases, the evidence for global warming will never be that convincing. But on the other hand, we can't wait because the consequences are so great. So I would well imagine that if we replayed what you just said about how can we get people to believe in global warming or climate change, then there is a sense in which we do need to do that. It's not a case of, it's hard to know. What are you counseling for a case like that?
Well, I'm not saying that people should, I think there is a danger of despair. There is a danger of saying, of erroneously saying to ourselves, no one ever changes their mind about anything and it's all culture and all innate predispositions, and so there we are, which is what bothers me a little bit about the notion that there's temperamental basis for political positions, that people are fundamentally temperamentally conservative or liberal and so on, because I don't understand in those frameworks how people can change their minds, and yet we know people change their minds. The country elected Reagan and then it elected Obama. It's not as if people are born a certain way and never change. So I take your point. But I think that this gets back to the big issue of the sort of Second Enlightenment arrangement for society that we're discussing. How, if you no longer can accept that people coolly and rationally tote up the losses and gains of a particular policy and look for their interests and then pick the one with the bigger number, if you know that's not how people interact with each other, if you know that's not how they persuade one another, well then what do you do? How do you have a conversation that is respectful of everyone and yet allows people to actually come to conclusions? All I would say is that I think there's a distinction between saying we know what the evidence says, or we know that the preponderance of the evidence indicates this, and that we have very good reasons for not waiting until we've persuaded every last person on Earth. It's just too dangerous. So we need to figure out how to best make the case. That's one thing. But saying, well, we need to figure out what's wrong with these people, why they are less rational than we are, I think it's a mistake. And I don't mean that. I don't mean, I want to wring my hands and feel bad about a strategy that works. It's that it doesn't work. It doesn't work. When people feel that they're being manipulated, when they feel that they're being conned, then their ears close. That you won't reach them. In other words, the effort to tell people, that the cities are all going to be underwater and we're all doomed unless you do X or Y, and science says so. it's not working. I mean, people are recycling less than they used to. I just read this morning in this country, and skepticism about global warming is growing. And so plainly, the tactics that have been tried are not working. And I think one of the reasons they're not working is because people can smell, because people are group-oriented, as you know so well. People can smell when something that is ostensibly about the facts is actually about you. People should be more like us people.
Right. So
Yeah,
one question is whether the discourse takes the form of a cooperative endeavor in which we, in some sense, regard ourselves as working together
Right.
to reach some conclusion in which we might disagree, but we have an objective
Right.
of reaching a conclusion.
Right.
To one which is more us versus them.
Right.
I don't categorize you as like me, and the more you try to get me to do something, the more that I resist.
Right.
And so I think a lot hinges on that distinction.
Right. But I mean, I mean, I've been in meetings where the environmental scientists who are very alarmed about the state of climate change and really want to affect change will say, this is what we can say, and this is what we're worried about, this is what we need the public to understand. And then the sort of the professional storytellers of politics, the people who come from the organizations and lobbying groups, say, no, that's not simple enough. That's not clear enough. You can't just say, this is a really good idea and probably will result in a better economy. You have to say, millions of green jobs, guaranteed.
Right.
At which point the scientists say, well, geez, that's not that's not science. We can't say anything's guaranteed. That's not the way we do science. Not the way we do climate science. So, I mean, I take your point. You can't just say, well, these people really don't like us and they don't agree with us, so let's just not talk to them. That's the end of civil society. But I think a lot of what passes for persuasive argument on both sides of the discourse divide is just preaching to the choir. It's just saying we are going to figure out how to get those people who do not see as clearly as we are to do what we want, and that doesn't work. People know, they see that coming, and they really hate it.
Yeah, totally. So it might be that there's no good solution. There's no good solution at all. I do think, and I've had other conversations on this regard, is that there has to be some kind of a chain with very good science on one end of the chain, and very good narrative on the other end of the chain.
Yeah.
And it's the responsibility of scientists to make sure that that chain exists, so that there's strong links from linking one to the other. But the science by itself is not great narrative,
right?
And the narrative by itself is not great science. So we have to forge that whole. Have to forge that whole chain. Yeah.
You had asked me before we got interrupted about sort of standards of conduct for science and science standards of conduct for science journalism, and I mean, perhaps what you just said touches on that. I mean, there are ways to create a narrative about science, and some of them are, I would say, legitimate, and some of them are not. I mean, it's a famous complaint in environmentalism that balance is biased. That instinct of American journalism to say, okay, I'm going to find someone who says yes, and then I'll call someone who says no, and I'll say this guy says yes, this guy says no.
Yeah, right.
But when something like climate change, that's not an accurate representation.
Or creationism.
Yeah, or creationism, right. So I mean, I would say that, and I think this speaks very much to your point that one thing that I always try to do writing about science is to represent what it really is, what's really going on in a lab or in field work, which is to say, not so and so poured the test tube into the other test tube and it turned green and boom, now we know something forever that is completely settled, and 2 weeks ago we didn't know it, because that's just not how it works. But it's true, again, it's this sort of prejudice for a neat, clear, beautiful narrative that we have. It's hard to get people interested in how we know versus what we know. That's, I mean, I like to post about epistemology on the blog. I like to post about, what people can and make of an MRI, or questions about the statistics that underlie psychological research or neuroscience research, and they don't get many hits. People would rather hear about dolphins communicating across the species barrier, or if you use cash instead of credit to buy your groceries, you're less likely to buy junk food, which is that's an interesting result. And I think anyway that we wrestle with how much to exaggerate the kind of finality of what we're talking about, because that's the pressure of narrative, to say this happened and that happened, and I'm a reliable teller of tales. What I'm telling you is true, versus the scientific impulse to say, well, this is how much confidence I have in this, because the scientific orientation is to be confident of the method more than it is of the final result, don't you think?
Totally. The method is beautiful.
Yeah.
But it's also like making sausages and laws. So, I mean, people who actually do science know what a fallible process it is.
Yeah.
It's not a straight path to the truth. It's often like a bloodhound circling around to find the scent. So I think for me the challenge is to explain the beauty of the process, and to praise it as better than almost any other process we have for arriving at something that could be called the truth of the matter, but also to appreciate its fallibility. And to make sure that people follow the rules, so that if the rules break down, then something very precious has been lost. This is one of the things that's making me quite passionate about actually, calling out some of my colleagues for what I think are infractions of not just science, but science journalism.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's increasing, or?
No, I think it's been bad for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I have some hobby horses. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them here. But I think one of the big problems is that someone who has a scientific reputation, well deserved for what they did, but then if they feel entitled to hold forth on any and all topics, and they don't even do the homework that a good science journalist would do.
Yeah,
they're just respected Mr. So-and-so, and so they can say anything they please. And I think that's just like, you shouldn't do that.
Yeah. I think it's Richard Feynman who said a scientist opinionating on a non-scientific topic is just as dumb as the next guy.
Oh, good. Will you please find me that quote?
I can send you the quote, or put up a link to it or something. And I that's definitely true. I mean, when you interview someone about what they have, what their passion and their expertise, that you can see when you leave that sweet spot. You can see when you leave that zone, because you spend an hour or two with them as a journalist, and you've been talking about snail shells or something, or super heavy elements, and then suddenly they're talking about how girls are different from boys, or what the Democrats have done in the last 3 years, and they sound like everyone else. And that's fine. Why shouldn't they sound like everyone else?
Well, but they're not functioning as a scientist at that time.
Right.
So basically, you're a scientist when you're functioning as a scientist. It doesn't matter if you have your PhD. And when you're functioning as a scientist, it depends on basically certain rules that we recognize as part of the scientific method. And if you're not doing that, then you're not a scientist on that topic. And that's what I would like to kind of establish. I think that some policing is required. And it's always exists in science. That's why we have a peer review process.
Yeah.
Even that doesn't work as well as it could. There's nothing like the peer review process for public scientific discourse. And so, guess what? You get poor quality as a result. So.
Yeah. I think that. People complain about it. They say, it takes forever, and they've got to do like a dozen extra steps because somebody so and so somewhere wants complain about something they don't care about. But it's true. It's sort of what Churchill said, right, about democracy. It's the worst system except for all the other systems. I think that Well, yeah. I mean, there are parallels. There are parallels in science journalism as well, where the most egregious of which is the giant, what I call the giant leap. The giant leap is you have one experiment with 35 undergraduates or something, or 65 undergraduates, and then you say, well, that means that women are worse at geometry than men everywhere for all time, or I'm trying to think, or that people with a lot of Facebook friends are potential serial killers, whatever. I mean, make it up. The point is the leap from that one experiment to a universal truth about human nature. But it's also true that the most compelling, the most honest stories, therefore, that you can tell about science are sort of within science. Like they're how so and so became passionate about such and such and what they did about it, and that makes for great reading. But it's kind of a niche. There are people who are fascinated by it and will read those stories, and there are people who aren't. And you don't want to only speak to a niche about some of the most important things that are happening on Earth. So,
well, let me finish up our interview with the topic of civility.
mm-hmm.
And in some ways, there's some concepts of productive discourse, including productive scientific discourse, which are basically adversarial, like the legal system. It's okay for you to go at it, but the result of that contest is something that can be called progress. So that would be an image that did not require civility, might not require civility. But on the other hand, I think there's another sense in which civility is very important. And what's your thought about the role of civility in discourse?
Well, I think a journalistic occupational hazard is this kind of name dropping that I try to avoid, but I'm going to do it now, which is why I prefaced it with that. And Clifford Geertz once said to me, because I interviewed him for the Airtime magazine, Clifford Geertz said to me, other people are just as real as you are. And that was kind of the point of the anthropology that he practiced. And I know he's a controversial figure, but I thought that was a really good point. And when I think of civility, that to me, I think, is the essence of it. It's not that you have to get along, that you aren't allowed to make distinctions or to say, I think I'm right and I think you're wrong. It's that at the point where you can turn the story into away from disagreement about is group selection established or not, to take something randomly out of the air. When you stop saying that that's a disagreement and trading evidence, and start saying the people who believe that it is established are just deluded and chasing themselves in folly, then you've forgotten that they're as real as you are, and that's. So when I think of civility, that's what I think is essential. And you mentioned courtrooms and so on, and scientific arguments, and it's true that you can be very harsh in a courtroom with your opponent, but lawyers, it drives the actual people who are involved in the case crazy to see the lawyers after they've basically torn each other apart, shake hands, and go out to dinner.
Yeah,
they have a very high standard of civility, a sort of professional guild standard. And I think that a lot of scientists do too. And so I think that within these kind of professional communities, there are very strict standards that are it doesn't matter what you feel. Like in Congress, you are not supposed to call, even if you think the opposite party are going to.
Well, that's why it was so shocking when that guy called Obama a liar during his.
It had never happened in American history. You're supposed to say, Mr. President, and you're supposed to say, will the gentleman from Indiana yield? Not will that moron from Indiana yield? And people play with that, but those conventions are they matter a great deal and so there's this civility in that sense, the surface thing. You're supposed to use, there's certain things you're just not allowed to say in a certain forum. But I think the deeper form of civility is a kind of humility. I guess it's a kind of it's a real willingness to come to an argument thinking, no matter how much you want to persuade, that you might learn something from the other guy's story.
Yeah,
and yeah, I agree with you. I think without that, it's just all flag waving.
And that's another problem is that as far as the public is concerned, there's nothing more exciting than a brawl. So
Yeah.
that's another temptation, basically, is to go into brawl mode, and then that's going to attract a lot of attention.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I guess that's
How
yeah.
many times have you seen on any go to any venue and you say
Yeah,
so and so mocks so and so? The word
yeah,
mock
that's
is in the
true.
headline because we're really that's going to attract a lot of attention if we get disparagement and that sort of thing. You'll get more hits, right?
Yeah, I guess that's true. So, I mean, I guess that's yeah. I mean, there again, there's that narrative thing. I mean, I mean, that's an exciting. I mean, someone said there are only what, like 7 or 8 different stories in the whole world with lots of subcategories, and so I mean, the big fight is certainly one of them. I mean, I'm hemming and hawing because I'm just thinking, well, how do you back away from? I mean, how do you? I mean, I think the question isn't. I don't think there's much point in bemoaning the fact that people are the way they are. And the question is, well, how do you undo it? Like once you get people in that state of mind, well, how do you undo it? And I think one of the ways that is well established is the common goal point that you made earlier.
Right.
You know, that people, if you get people thinking they were in this together to do this thing together, you could get very rapid change in the way that they. And that's why, I mean, when presidential elections closely fought, people, detest one another, and yet the loser always says, "Well, I congratulated the winner, and we're all behind him now." That people sort of groan and roll their eyes, but that's another very important tradition that is an attempt to remind everyone, even no matter how many hours you spent campaigning for the other guy, that there's a different sense in which we're all in it together, and I think that's the only way out of these things is to just get people thinking in a different frame.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'd like to recap it just very briefly.
Uh-huh.
We began by talking about the post-rational mind, which I think really does form the foundation for all of this, because what it says is that we're the kind of species that's just like so fallible and so prone to believe in falsehoods, to defend falsehoods.
Mm-hmm.
We're not at all like scientists in terms of the way we are as individuals or even as groups.
Yeah.
Unless we establish some kind of process,
Yeah.
then we're never going to get to the truth of the matter.
Right.
And science is a relatively recent cultural invention, which does that pretty well. Civility is an important part of the process. It's very important for us to think that we're all, in some sense, in one cooperative group in order to do that.
Yeah.
If that's not the case, then just forget about it. Nothing good will come of it. And so these are some of the elements that there are statements about the way we are as a species. There are statements about the way science is, and there are the statements about the way discourse is. And so these are profound issues at the same time that they're impinging upon what we're trying to do as journalists, as scientists. Certainly, what we're trying to do in this new venture of ours, our magazine, Evolution: This View of Life. So I'm very happy to have featured you on the magazine and to link to your great blog, Mind Matters, on the Big Think website. And I hope that we'll be crossing paths many times in order to cover these issues of science.
Great. Well, I do too, David. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be in at the beginning of this really great venture.
Super. All right. So this is David Stone Wilson signing off for Evolution: This View of Life. Thank you very much, David.
You're welcome. Thank you.